excited to have Sean today as our guest speaker for our lunch lecture. I'm just going to read his brief bio and then let him take it from there. So Professor Therriot's primary research interests are American political institutions, primarily the U.S. Congress. He's published 2 books and numerous articles on subjects ranging from presidential rhetoric to congressional careers, and the Louisiana Purchase to the Pendleton Act of 1883. He continues to do research on party polarization in the U.S. Congress. He has received numerous teaching awards, including the Friar Society Teaching Fellowship, the biggest undergraduate teaching award at UT. So we're excited to have you.
Great, thanks. Thanks a lot for the introduction. So I don't know, how many of you went to the talk yesterday? So just, oh, all right, about half of you. So this talk is going to be pretty substantive, and it's not going to delve much on the statistics part of it, but yet there are, I'm sure, lots of statistical questions that come up. And so I'd encourage you to stop me during the presentation if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them then, or we can talk about it at the end of the talk. But this is mostly a talk for political junkies. But I was particularly excited to address this, one, because Sheldon asked me to. And generally, anytime Sheldon asks me to do anything, I do it. But secondly, because I'm struggling right now. And the reason I'm struggling is because I don't know if I want to write an academic book or if I want to write like a trade press book. And for those of you that have where this question comes up, you know that the biggest difference between those 2 books is the presentation of statistical material. So if I write the trade press book, then I have to like get rid of all the tables, and we just have to go with really pretty charts and pictures. And so, but my natural inclination is to do the stats, because I think that's where the best part of the story comes. So I look forward to getting your comments. And just to condition you, anytime I'm talking about Republicans or the Gingrich senators particularly, I'll have them in red. This will be a nice kind of like little sociological experiment I'm playing. The origins of this really come from my second book, which was published a year ago. In that, it's called Party Polarization in Congress. And quite simply, I make the argument that the House and the Senate are both polarizing. So this is just looking at an ideological score. So DW nominate is just an algorithm where we put in all roll call votes ever taken place on the floor of the House or the floor of the Senate. And then we have the computer spit out and tell us who is really extremely liberal and who's really extremely conservative. Of course, computers can't tell us that, but it can show us how alike people vote. And once we look at that list, it's pretty easy to tell who the extreme conservatives and extreme liberals are. So if we go back to the Reconstruction, which is the 45th Congress, we see that the parties were pretty far apart. The mean is the black line in between, and then one standard deviation on either side are the colored bars. And so we see that for much of the first 100 years after Reconstruction, the parties converged. But then in the last 30 years, or so, 40 years, the parties have started diverging again. And we see that this is both true in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. Of course, the Senate, because it has 100 members, it has bigger standard deviations with respect to the ideologies. And when we look at the difference between party polarization in the House and the Senate, we see that for much of the period, especially this is just since the 1970s until 2008, we see that the parties were about polarized at the same level. But we only know that because of the looking at the DW nominates. But of course, the one thing that the DW nominates doesn't control for, the ideology scores don't control for, is the existence of the same issues on the floor of the House and the Senate. It could be that the House takes up radically more polarizing issues than the Senate. Or it could be in the process of debating something, they take many more votes on polarizing issues before they take a final passage vote. So the one way we can assess whether or not the House and the Senate have polarized similarly is we can look at 2 types of votes which are common to both chambers. So the first, I never know how much people know about the legislative process, but we have a House and we have a Senate. And if they pass different bills, then it can't go to the president. So the bills first have to be reconciled, and then it goes to the president. So if they pass different bills, then what used to be a conference committees happen less and less in the current Congress. But generally, they went to a conference committee made up of both people from the House and the Senate. And they would come up with the same bill. And then that same bill goes back to both respective chambers under the exact same procedures, and it's for an up or down vote. At that point, you can't amend what's called the conference committee report. You either have to approve, the chamber has to approve it, or they have to reject it. And so it's the exact same piece of legislation facing the exact same question, whether or not to approve the conference committee report. And then if it happens that both chambers approve that conference committee report, it goes to the president. And of course, the president can either sign or veto it. Well, if the president vetoes it, then the bill goes back to Capitol Hill. And once again, both chambers can ultimately take the exact same vote again on overriding the presidential veto. So again, it's the exact same piece of legislation and the exact same question on that piece of legislation, which is to override the veto. So if we just isolate our data set down to these two votes, which are common across chambers, we see, once again, that the parties have polarized about the same level. Of course, any given Congress, it can fluctuate a great deal because of the number of votes that they take on conference committee adoptions or on presidential veto overrides, and then, of course, the polarization. But here we're just interested in the difference between the House and the Senate to assess as to whether or not they're polarizing similarly over time. And of course, when we take the average from the 1970s to the 2000s, we see that there's a very slight difference in the average between the House and the Senate. So all of this is to suggest to you that the House and the Senate have polarized similarly. If we, in my book and in the rest of this research that I'm going to be presenting this afternoon, we're really looking just at 1970-73 is the 93rd Congress. So this is 1970s up until sometime in the George Bush second term. Sometimes I extend the analysis all the way to the 110th Congress. Other times, as in this picture, it's only 108th. There's not much difference that happened in the 109th and 110th. And we're currently in the 111th. So this is the Senate, 1973 to 2004. And here, right, so I'm going to play on the political junkie side a little bit. So I'll test you to see how good you all are at your political trivia. Any idea who either one of these folks are?
It's Alaska.
Yeah, it is Alaska. Ted Stevens. So Senator Ted Stevens, you might know him because he described the internet as a bunch of tubes and whistles, or no, what was it? What?
You can't just dump it on a truck.
Right, no, that's right. So yeah, that's Ted Stevens. And I think the bottom guy actually looks like a Kennedy, but it's not a Kennedy. Any idea who that is? It's Fritz Hollings from South Carolina. And the reason I have those two folks up there is because Ted Stevens in the 93rd Congress was the median Republican. So the average Republican in the early 1970s was someone like Ted Stevens. So Ted Stevens clearly doesn't know much about how the internet works. But Ted Stevens is a big fan of government spending, right? He's from Alaska. They expect a lot of government spending up there. He's a big fan of NPR and kind of national things like that. So he's a pretty moderate Republican. He would never describe himself as pro-choice, but pro-lifers certainly would describe him as pro-choice. And then Fritz Hollings is a classic Southern Democrat, a populist. So by no means an extreme raging liberal. So that's what the Senate looked like in the 1970s. If we fast forward it to the 2004, the average Republican becomes the guy up on top. Who's this guy? Anyone? Yeah, George Allen from Virginia. Who's better otherwise known as Macaca, right? So he's the one that talked about Macaca in the 2006 elections that ultimately swings his election to his opponent, and with that swing of that seat, the Democrats take control of the Senate in 2006. So he's much more conservative. He had aspirations of running for president until he lost his Senate seat. And then, and this is the guy on the bottom. Does anyone know who he is? Right? He's Harry Reid. And that's how Harry's feeling these days when he looks at his poll results in Nevada. He's not faring too well for the fall. So the average Democrat goes from someone who's a populist Southern Democrat to the leader, Nevada, the majority leader in the Senate. And the Republicans go from someone like Ted Stevens to George Allen. So that should give you a little bit of a feel for how much more polarized the institution is. If we isolate it to the 108th Congress, we see that there's very little overlap between the parties. So once again, blue, Democrats, extreme left, and then Republicans, red, extreme right. And of course, the median folks I'll put up first. So that, again, is George Allen and Harry Reid. So Harry Reid's DW nominate is somewhere in here. George Allen is somewhere in here. I think the other cases are a little bit more interesting. So here's the most conservative Republican in the Senate. Anyone know who this guy is? Yeah. All right, you can no longer speak. Cochran from Oklahoma, known as Dr. No. So he's I'm going to get this, an obstetrician. Is that someone that delivers babies? Yeah. So he's an obstetrician. Yeah, clearly medicine isn't my field. But they call him Dr. No because he says no to anything having to do with the government. So think of Ron Paul in the Senate, and you have someone pretty close to Tom Cochran. Well, take away the reasonability of Tom Paul, and you end up with someone like Tom Cochran. And then on the extreme left and that's hard to see, but that's Russ Feingold from Wisconsin. And here he is meeting with the Democratic leaders. Good, so you guys can see the clowns. Yeah, so that's Russ Feingold. McCain Feingold, so famous for the campaign finance reform, also up for election this fall. The two folks in the middle in the 108th Congress was Link Chafee from Rhode Island, and then Zell Miller, Democrat from Georgia. Zell Miller famously went to the 2008 election, or 2004 election, and gave a speech endorsing George Bush. So no doubt that he's pretty conservative. And so this is Link Chafee here, and then this is Zell Miller here. And the interesting thing about the 108th Congress is since then, both those guys have left. So now in today's Senate, there's no Republican who is more liberal than the most conservative Democrat. There's complete separation of the two parties in the Senate. So there are three reasons why people say that the parties are polarized. The first one is redistricting, right? And we in Texas know this really well because of kind of the drama of what Tom DeLay put us through earlier this decade, when he thought that if we drew the lines, or an argument is such that if you draw the lines, then you can create really conservative districts and you can create really liberal districts. And the way that Tom DeLay did it is he tried to create as many really conservative districts as possible, getting rid of as many Democrats as possible. And if we think this happens in state after state, census after census, then over time we'd expect there to be huge discrepancies between the districts that Democrats represent and the districts that Republicans represent. The second argument is geographic sorting. And Austin is a really nice place to think about this because if you care about having government services, if you care about having infrastructure, if you care about kind of having a lively downtown scene, then you'll live in downtown Austin. But if you care about low property taxes, and if you care about kind of like people leaving your guns alone and kind of keeping the government at arm's length distance away, then you'll live in Williamson County. And so here in Texas we have Lloyd Doggett, or here in Austin we have Lloyd Doggett, a very liberal Democrat who represents us, and up in Williamson County they have John Carter. And so the argument with geographic sorting is that people just move into locations where they live with people that think like them politically. And no one argues that they do it with the express purpose of living next to their fellow Democrats or fellow Republicans, but just the kind of things that Democrats value draws someone to a particular location. The kind of things that Democrats value draws someone to a location. Kind of a side note on this, and I need to find this chart. The New York Times did a chart back when The Passion of the Christ was a big movie and 9/11, and they showed the top movie theaters for Passion of the Christ and the top movie grossing theaters for 9/11, and there was absolutely no overlap, right? So all of the Passion of the Christ movie theaters were in the heartland, the flyover states, how people in California and New York refer to us. And then all of the people that really love 9/11 were on the coasts. And so just kind of another example of the geographic separation that's happened. The third explanation that the literature really gives us for why the parties have separated are that the rules and procedures have changed. So it used to be in Sam Rayburn's house back in the 1950s, he'd get together with Democrats and Republicans, people would figure out a solution, they'd pass it. Fast forward to the Newt Gingrich Congresses or the Denny Hastert Congresses or now the Nancy Pelosi Congresses, which we're seeing in spades, is Nancy Pelosi gets a majority of her Democrats on, gets to vote 218, and then rams it through however she can. To the extent that she even talked about deeming and passing healthcare legislation. So the argument for rules and procedures is just that they have become so much more polarizing that you couldn't help it if you're a Democrat to vote more liberally or if you're a Republican to vote more conservatively. The problem with each of these explanations is they don't work in the Senate, right? In the Senate we don't have redistricting. In the Senate, we don't, we could have geographic sorting, but it would require someone from Austin moving to Lafayette, Louisiana, or Norman, Oklahoma? I don't even know if that's, or Las Cruces, New Mexico. Like, it's really hard to imagine people moving that far away. And then the rules and procedures, of course, the Senate is still supposed to be this staid body that where the greatest deliberative body in the world, and these sorts of norms where it's a lot harder for Harry Reid to ram things through than it is for Nancy Pelosi. And so each of the arguments fails, which leaves kind of congressional scholars shrugging a little bit and saying, well, why exactly is that? And what I'm going to present to you is my answer for why it is the Senate has polarized almost as much as the House. Of course, I'm building on the work of other people, or even people who used to serve in the Senate. So this is Alan Simpson talking. He says, the rancor, the dissension, the disgusting harsh levels came from those House members who came to the Senate. They brought it with them. That's where it began. Alan Simpson, incidentally, is the chair of the President's Commission on Reducing the Deficit. So we're going to be hearing more about Alan Simpson, I think, in the news over the next 6 or 8 months. Another senator, actually someone who's still serving, is Thad Cochran. He says it's just a matter of age. I'm not going to use the word maturity. I love it when people say I'm not going to use a word and then they use it. So this is Thad Cochran from Mississippi. Incidentally, his longtime colleague in the Senate was Trent Lott, right? And there was not much love lost between the two of them. So I think that when he's saying this, he's really thinking of Trent Lott. And of course, when we look to political science, we have Barbara Sinclair from UCLA, who says the 1990s saw an influx of ideologically committed conservatives into the Senate, with many of them being veterans of the highly partisan House. And then in language, not becoming really of political scientists, but language that I like a little bit more, political scientist Ray and Campbell talk about the baptizing by former Minority Leader Newt Gingrich into the relentless and combative partisanship. And so it seems as though there's something happening with the House sending former House members to the Senate, and then that's causing the Senate to change and to become almost as polarized as the House is. But the problem with this argument is that if we look at the number of House members who go from the House to the Senate, it's stayed roughly the same over the time period. I mean, there's a little bit of a difference, but the number of former House members in the Senate was greatest at the beginning of the cycle and at the end of the cycle. And so the problem with that is the party polarization, of course, we know, is lowest in the early part of the cycle, and it's greatest at the end of the cycle. And so if we're just using the number of House members to explain Senate party polarization, it doesn't do a very good job, because at the extremes of party polarization, we have high numbers of the House. So that alone can't do it. But if we look at a particular kind of House member, those that were baptized in the waters of Newt Gingrich, we see that the number of Gingrich senators has increased from the 99th Congress. And I'll specifically define Gingrich senators here in a second. But just know that they're increasing over time. So Gingrich senators. So right, the red. There he is, Newt Gingrich, who's now writing books and talking about Nazism and the Obama administration. Here are our Gingrich senators. I don't know if you'll recognize some of those names. I'll put some faces with some names, and then maybe it'll help you create this story of what I mean when I say Gingrich senators. This would be a lot funnier if Sheldon were in the room, but Sheldon's not in the room. So has anyone taken Stephen Jesse's class? So he's doing a Bayes class. So these are all people associated with UT, of course. So that's Sheldon. Does anyone know, do people know Sheldon? So he's kind of the godfather of this program. And that's Larry Faulkner. So Sheldon's not in the room, so there's a reason that I couldn't put Bill Powers' picture up there. And then, of course, Mac Brown and Jody Conrad. The reason that you would know that these aren't Gingrich senators is because all the Gingrich senators are men. So as soon as I show you pictures of two women, you should know that it can't be the right folks. So let's look at the real Gingrich senators. So the shortest serving Gingrich senator is Jim Talent. He served 2 terms, 2 Congresses, so 4 years. He took over after he won in a special election in Missouri, where a dead man beat the previous senator, and the dead man's wife was named to the seat for 2 years, and then the dead man's wife lost to Jim Talent in a special election. And the longest serving Gingrich senator is John McCain. And it used to be when I started on this project that I didn't want to include John McCain's picture in talking about Gingrich senators, because John McCain is known for working across the aisle and being, one of those people that really forages bipartisan compromise. But then he lost a presidential election, and he's become bitter. And so this Congress is acting like the rest of the Gingrich senators. So it's wonderful. So I proudly display his photo now. Looking quite dapper, I think. So that's John McCain. there are other folks who really are good legislators and who everyone on Capitol Hill regards as just being kind of like those workhorses in the Senate that kind of get stuff done, including Craig Thomas from Wyoming and Mike DeWine from Ohio, and then John Sununu from New Hampshire. Incidentally, all three of these people are no longer in the Senate, but nonetheless, some Gingrich senators were really good legislators, including the three of them. And then another aspect of the Gingrich senatorsness is scandal. And so Larry Craig is the guy up here in the upper right, who you might remember from famous scenes such as the Minneapolis men's room. And here we have John Ensign, who from Nevada, who famously had an affair with his best friend, with his best friend's wife, who was on his staff. And then John Ensign's father tried to pay off the entire family that used to be, yeah, sordid affair. And then, of course, David Vitter, our neighbor from Louisiana, who had a long-term relationship with a D.C. madam and one of the D.C. madam's call girls, only breaking it off when he learned that her real name was Kathy, which happened to also be his wife's name. I should mention that David Vitter is up by 20 points in the polls heading into November. So doesn't seem to create many problems for him in Louisiana. In fact, I think they probably went up. And then there's some other people, and these are the folks that I think of when I think of Gingrich senators. So John Allen, and then who we've already talked about, and Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania, and then Jim DeMint from South Carolina. So these are Jim DeMint. If there is someone from the Tea Party movement in leadership currently in the Senate, it's Jim DeMint. Like he's taken the cue of the Tea Party folks in endorsing all the same people that they are. So there's your group of Gingrich senators, or at least 20 of them or so. Interestingly, of all of these folks, all 33 people who I label as Gingrich senators, there's only 2 of the 33 who have an average ideology less than the Republican average. So, and that's just DeWine from Ohio and Jim Talent from Missouri. Just those 2 guys were the only ones who would be what we would call in the moderate half of the Republican caucus. All 31 other Gingrich senators are folks who are on the more conservative half of the Republican Party. So let's nail down what a Gingrich senator is. And it's not because I chose them. They abide by this particular definition. And there's 3 terms that make it up. First of all, Republicans. So they have to be Republicans in order to be baptized in the waters of Newt Gingrich. The second thing is they previously have had to serve in the House. So even though there are some folks, Jeff Sessions being one, who's the chairman of the Judiciary Committee in the Senate right now, who will shortly be helping contribute to the hearings on the Kagan nomination, even though he acts very much like a Gingrich senator, he never served in the House. So he isn't classified as. So they have to be Republican, they have to have served in the House of Representatives, and they have to have been elected to Congress after 1978. And the reason that 1978 is so crucial is because that's when Newt Gingrich is elected. So all of these folks, all 33 folks on the previous slides, were elected to the House starting in 1980 and moving forward. Not elected to the Senate, but elected to the House. And I've done lots of sensitivity analysis. And sure enough, in doing all of the number crunching and everything, 1978 is the critical year. And it's when the triple interaction term works best. It's when the model does the best job at predicting. And it also, doing all sorts of sensitivity analysis, it's the House that matters, when they're elected to the House, not when they're elected to the Senate. So even though we're talking about their Senate behavior, it's much better predictor of knowing when they entered the House than when they entered the Senate. So of course, because I have three interaction terms to create the triple interaction, which we call the Gingrich senators, we have to have 3 double interactions. So we have to interact the Republicans times former House members, Republican times elected after 78, and then former House times 1978. And then of course, when we include the 4th, the triple interaction, we're talking about 4 interactions that become critical. And later on, when I show you simulations of the effect of Gingrich senatorness, it's taking into consideration all 4 interaction terms. So it's just not looking at this coefficient of the triple interaction and making kind of conclusions based on it. But it's also looking at how those 3 factors filtered through in the double interactions. So to kind of help get your hands around this, we're talking about a particular set of group So Republicans first off, who have served in the House and came in after the 98th Congress. So we're focusing on this square. So in addition, of course, to the Republicans, we also have Senate. So just for simplicity, we call them Gephardt senators. And all that means is that they served, Gephardt entered the chamber at about the same time that Newt Gingrich did. And he is a Democrat, and he ultimately became minority leader back in the early 2000s before he quit to run for president, and Nancy Pelosi ascended to the top of the Democratic leadership. And so we just call them Gephardt senators. But we're interested in this square. But yet, in order to make determinations about this square, we have to know what's happening in each of the other 3 squares for the Republicans, and then the other 4 squares for Democrats. So let's first look at just the Republicans now, and looking at their average DW nominate scores. So if we go back to the 93rd Congress again, early 1970s, this is the Republicans with House experience prior to Newt Gingrich entering the House, and this is Republicans without House experience prior to Newt Gingrich entering the House. And then the Gingrich senators is the line on top, indicating that they're most conservative. And they're the most conservative by quite a bit. They're more conservative than the people who entered after Newt Gingrich entered the House. So these are senators who entered the Senate after Newt Gingrich entered the House. And they're a good bit more conservative than folks who served in the House before Newt Gingrich came. So in all of our comparison groups, they're more conservative. When we take into consideration these 4 different groups, as well as the Democrats, and the numbers that help to compose each of these lines, we can assess the extent to which the Gingrich senators are polarizing the Senate. So taking into consideration the 3 other Republican groups plus the 4 Democratic groups, so all other 7 groups, we see that polarization in the Senate would only look like this. So you'd have to look at that with your head cocked and out of one eye before you could really see an upward trend. I mean, there's a very, very slight upward trend. But as soon as we add in the Gingrich senators to the mix, they almost perfectly explain all of the increasing partisanship of the Senate. And it's a consequence of both them voting more conservatively and the fact that the Gingrich senators are growing in number over time. So both of those things are critical. So to see if we're really onto something, we plug all of this into a big equation, and so we see our 3 double interactions and then our triple interaction, which we're calling Gingrich senators. It's statistically significant, which makes us happy. We include member random effects, which accounts for the fact that we have different senators serving in different Congresses, or the same senator serving in different Congresses. Indicating that we're talking about 18 different Congresses, and we're doing a pretty good job of predicting someone's DW nominate. But we don't have to spend too much time on that unless if y'all want. And I should say that we're also controlling for a basic time trend up at the top, just because we know that partisanship is increasing over time. So if we look at the DW nominates in using that baseline model, and we come up with someone with no House experience before Newt Gingrich. So this is someone who was elected prior to 1978, elected the Senate prior to 1978, who did not serve in the House. That member's estimated DW nominate is 0.409. And that is Orrin Hatch from Utah. He's the typical no House experience before Gingrich senator. The no House experience after Gingrich is Chuck Hagel from Iowa. And we see that his ideology is a little bit more. And in fact, yeah, so we could think of this guy almost as like well, I'll save that. So 1978, when Newt Gingrich comes in, what's big that happens to the Republican Party in 1980? Reagan. Yeah, Reagan. And so this is really kind of controlling for the Reagan effect. So it could just be, it could have nothing to do with Newt Gingrich and the House or anything like that, but it could have everything to do with Reagan trying, finally convincing Republicans that they can be conservative and be proud of being conservative. But this is our control group. So these folks entered in the age of Reagan, but didn't serve in the House. And their average ideology is 0.46. So if we go to the House member, here's the picture of Thad Cochran smiling because Trent Lott is no longer in the Senate. And their average ideology is 0.341. And that's really consistent with the literature. For the longest time, we thought that serving in the House and then moving to the Senate would only assure that you have someone who really knows the legislative process, really cares about the institution of Congress, and would kind of protect the institution of Congress. And so they would be more moderate because they would reach across the aisle a little bit more. And then your average Gingrich senator is 0.49. And that's Saxby Chambliss from Georgia. So we see that he is almost, he and his other 32 colleagues are almost 50% more conservative than the other Republican groups. And then to just show you the comparison for the Democrats. So we have Jeff Bingaman from New Mexico, who has an average ideology of minus 0.331. Joe Lieberman in his glamour shot days has an average ideology of minus 0.35. Bob Byrd from West Virginia, and then Maria Cantwell, who would be the Gephardt senator. And we see that her behavior isn't that much different. She's only about, not even 10% more liberal than the other groups of the other three Democratic groups. And just to kind of give you an indication that it's not just in the 110th Congress, if we look at the 111th Congress, and I know this chart is hard to see, and we look at the Senate, and we look at the Republicans who oppose the president the most, which are those groups right there, I think there's 13 names there, and only one of them is not a Gingrich senator, and that being Jeff Sessions from Mississippi. Everyone else is a Gingrich senator, topped by Cochran up top. Can't see the names really well. DeWine is number 2. Yeah, John Thune is up there. Maybe I can see. No, I can't. Yeah, Jim Bunning, Inhofe, and so on. So it's continuing today. So what explains this Gingrich effect? Is it truly that they've been baptized in the waters of Newt Gingrich? It could be, but we want to see if there might not be other characteristics of these folks. It could be quite simply that they just come from more conservative states. It might have nothing to do with the fact that they serve in the House, but everything to do with the fact that they come from Nebraska and Kentucky and Oklahoma and Georgia and South Carolina. So we want to control for their constituency. It could be electoral. It could be that former House members have an easier time winning Senate elections, and as a consequence of them being safer, they can be more ideological. Where someone from New York or Pennsylvania who really has to fight through every single election has to kind of be more moderate to try to appeal to enough independents so that they can ultimately win. It could be that truly the House changed them, that there truly is something about baptism by Newt Gingrich that makes them the way that they are. Or lastly, it could just be something in their DNA. And unfortunately, as much as I beg and try and plead, they won't give me their DNA, so I can't do the tests to nail this hypothesis. Today's presentation, I'll just talk about the first two. But I will suggest to you that it's not that the House changed them. In fact, if we look at their behavior in the House, they don't behave any differently than the rest of the House Republican Conference. So they're very typical of the House Republican Conference. So let's look at the first two, constituency and electoral. So in order to get at the constituency and electoral, these variables are here. And don't strain your eyes too much. I'll get rid of all the other variables except for the triple interaction and the constituency and election variables. So this is the triple interaction in the base model. This is what we use to come up with the simulations that I showed a little bit earlier. When we include constituency variables, so the first one is the Republican presidential vote advantage. Think of this as nothing more than how a Republican presidential candidate does above their national average. So in Texas is like a +8, I think, for Republicans, meaning that Republicans in Texas, so it means that John McCain did 8 points better in Texas than he did in the rest of the nation. The second kind of variable that we use to measure the constituency is whether or not the districts in the South, we interact that with Republicans, with their being Republican, because we might think that the relationship would be different for Democrats than it is for Republicans. And finally, the last one is just the state population. Once again, kind of drawing on this idea that if you come from a pretty small state, it could be really ideologically conservative. And so we just want to test for, we want to include a characteristic that differentiates New York from South Dakota, for example. And then we look at two election variables, their victory margin, how much did they win their election to the Senate by, and whether or not they are elected versus appointed to the seat. And we see that neither one of them are doing much effect. Interestingly, though, when we include the constituency effect, we see that it knocks out some of the power of the Gingrich senator variable. And then when we include all of them in the same model, we see, once again, that, that the Gingrich senator loses some of its effect. It's still statistically significant. It's about as 2/3 as big. But remember that we also have to include all of the double interactions before we can really say too much about the substantive significance of that reduction in the coefficient. So let's look at the Gingrich effect. So going back to our baseline model, not including constituency and election variables, we found that Gingrich senators were simulated to have an ideology of 0.49. When we compare that 0.49 to the other three groups of the Republicans, we find that Gingrich senators are on average 62% more conservative than the rest of the Republicans. When we go to the model controlling for constituency and electoral factors, we see that their simulation comes down a little bit because, of course, they come from more conservative states. They come from smaller states, and there's an interaction happening with the South. We find that they're only 53% more conservative than the rest of the Republicans. So in fact, when we include the constituency and the electoral factors, it soaks up some of the analysis. So about 15% of this Gingrich effect can be explained by constituency and electoral factors. And in fact, it's almost entirely by the constituency factors. The electoral factors really don't do much power in telling us about the ideology of Republican senators. So about 15. So we still have 85% of this effect to explain. So maybe that 85% has something to do with the baptizing of Newt Gingrich. So a couple of lessons from today's talk. First is I hope that you walk away with knowing something about the something more about the legislative process, and that the House and the Senate have polarized similarly, especially over the last 30, 40 years. The second lesson I hope that you take away is that almost all of the increase in the Senate party polarization over that 40 years can be explained by Gingrich senators, by these 33 individuals who previously served in the House, Republicans, and served in the House after Newt Gingrich was already there. And finally, the third is about 15% of that Gingrich effect can be explained by the constituencies. So I think that's it. I'd be a little bit reluctant to go that far. What we see happening, and it's really interesting, and I think that there could be a book that I choose to write about 10 years talking about the Democrats who were elected in 2006 and 2008 to the Senate. So what we know about that group of folks is that they're a good bit more liberal than the Democrats were there before. So maybe we're coming around to having an Obama senator effect. But no doubt that the lion's share of what's happening with respect to at least the voting scores can be explained by the Gingrich senators. There's no doubt, though, that they're reacting to what the Democrats are doing. So it could be that that group is reacting to Democrats in a way different than other Republican senators. And so it could be simply a reaction to Democratic leadership. One of the things that I'm doing in this book is looking at exactly which issues the Gingrich senators are most unlike the rest of the other Republicans. And it could just be that they just have different reactions. And looking at how they behaved when they're in the majority, which is from 1994 up until, well, besides for 18 months in the early 2000s, up until 2006, and then seeing how they behave in the opposition. I suspect that they were pretty loyal Republicans when they were in the majority, but now it seems to me at least they're trying to gum up the process at every chance they can possibly get in the opposition.
To what extent is the class of '78 a reaction to the post-Watergate kind of, I guess, rallying of the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. So a little bit of history. In the early 1970s, of course, we have Watergate. We have the Watergate babies in 1974, which were these really liberal group of Democrats who came to the House. And so maybe this kind of late 70s Republican effect is nothing more than the Republican reaction to that 74. I have no doubt that that may be why the waters of the Gingrich baptism are different, is because of the way that the Democrats poisoned the waters in the early 1970s. The Republican caucus goes through a pretty huge fight in the early 1980s when Newt Gingrich ultimately enters the leadership. So this is for minority whip. So Bob Michael is the Republican leader, and I can't remember why there's a vacancy. I can't remember. But there's a vacancy in the middle of a Congress, and the Republicans have to choose between Ed Madigan, who's very much in the Bob Michael wing of the Republican Party. That's the, kind of get along to go along. Like, sure, we're not in the majority party, but the Democrats are working with us well enough, and they're allowing us some input on bills, and so we'll just continue to get along with them. And he ran against Newt Gingrich. And Newt Gingrich said, look, we're never going to become the majority party if we keep doing what we've been doing for 40 years. The only way that we're going to be able to rebuild this house is if we tear down this house. And so that was very much his kind of strategy. And that very much could have been a reaction to the reforms and kind of the atmosphere that the Democrats brought to the House with the Watergate babies. Interestingly, during this election, there were 8 people who would become Gingrich senators. So 8 House members were serving and could vote in that election. And 7 of the 8 voted for Newt Gingrich. Only 1 of them voted for Ed Madigan. An election that was decided by 1 vote. So the one exception is Pat Roberts from Kansas, who today looks every bit as much like a Gingrich senator as everyone else. Other questions?
To what extent do you know that it's the Newt Gingrich effect, not something that happened after 78? So you had a pretty conservative administration, then you had Bill Clinton, who was not terribly liberal.
Right.
And so it could be that just, this conservative administration for so many years.
That's right.
brought
Yeah, and that would be, like I